By the end of the 16th century, centralization of power by controlling taxes, the army, and some aspects of religion coalesced into a system of government that led to a powerful monarch in England and absolute monarchy in France. In other states, different methods were used to solidify authority, building temples, as with India, paying the military elite a salary, as with the samurai in Japan, and forcibly establishing a captive governmental bureaucracy, as with the Ottoman Devonshire system. Rulers of empires in the years from 1450 to 1750 developed methods for assuring they maintained control of all the regions of their empires. Some of the successful methods including using bureaucratic elites to oversee sections of the empire and developing a professional military. England's King James I believed in the divine rights of kings, a common claim from the Middle Ages that the right to rule was given to a king by God. Under this belief, a king was a political and religious authority, as seen in the quote on the first slide. James believed himself outside of the law, an earthly authority, and saw any challenge toward him as a challenge to God. In England, the Tudors ruled from 1485 to 1603 and relied on justices of the peace, officials selected by the landed gentry to, according to their oath of office, swear that as justice of the peace in all articles in the king's commission to you directed, ye shall do equal right to the poor and to the rich, after your cunning wit and power, and after the laws and customs of the realm and statutes thereof made. In other words, their job was to maintain peace in the counties of England, even settling some legal matters, and to carry out the monarch's laws. The number of responsibilities of the justices of the peace increased through the years of Tudor rule, and they became among the most important and powerful groups in the kingdom. Under Tudor rule in England, the power of the feudal lords was weakened. Many seats in the House of Commons and Parliament were occupied by justices of the peace. The justices of the peace, as well as the Parliament, which had been established in 1275, gave legitimacy to the monarch's claim to authority. Parliament also checked the monarch's powers. In 1689, England's rulers, William and Mary, signed the English Bill of Rights, which assured the individual civil liberties. For example, legal processes was required before someone could be arrested and detained. The Bill of Rights also guaranteed protection against tyranny of the monarchy by requiring the agreement of Parliament on matters of taxation and raising an army. In contrast to developments in England, the French government became more absolute, directed by one source of power, the king, with complete authority in the 17th and 18th centuries. Henry IV, who ruled from 1589 to 1610 of the House of Valois, listened to his advisors, who advocated the divine right of the monarchy. Building on these ideas, Louis XIII, who ruled from 1610 to 1643, and his minister, Cardinal Rousseau, moved to even greater centralization of the government and development of the system of the intendants. These intendants were royal officials, bureaucratic elites, sent out to the provinces to execute the orders of the central government. The intendants themselves were sometimes called tax farmers because they oversaw the collection of various taxes in support of the royal governments. The Sun King, Louis XIV, who ruled from 1643 to 1715, espoused the theory of divine right and was a virtual dictator. His aims were twofold, just as those of Rousseau had been. He wanted to hold absolute power and expand French borders. Louis declared that he was the state. He combined the lawmaking and the justice system in his own person. He was absolute. He kept nobles close to him in his palace at Versailles, making it difficult for them to act independently or plot against him. Louis and his successors' refusal to share power eventually weakened the French government. Here's a chart that shows a comparison of both Emperor Kangxi and King Louis XIV. Both ruled extensively for a long time and both became rulers as children. Both were introduced to Western education and were multilingual, supported the arts, loved landscape design, ruled during the golden age of their empires. Where they different was, of course, first of all, Kangxi will open ports to foreigners. He extends in Tibet, whereas France extends their borders east at the expense of Germany. Social hierarchy in Moscow was almost static. Much of it had been in Kiev and Russia earlier. The noble landowning class, known as the boyars, stood at the top of the social pyramid. Below them were the merchants. Last and most numerous were the peasants, who would gradually sink more and more deeply into debt, and as a result, into serfdom. Serfs were peasants who received a plot of land and protection from a noble. In return, serfs were bound to that land and had little personal freedom. Transfers of land ownership to another noble included control over the serfs on that land. The boyar class experienced tensions with the rulers similar to the tensions between nobles and rulers in Western Europe. Boyars of Novgorod who opposed the expansionist policies of Ivan IV, so Ivan punished them after his forces defeated Novgorod. Ivan IV confiscated the lands of his boyar opponents and forced them and their families to move to Moscow. Like Louis XIV, he wanted to keep an eye on the nobility. To further control the boyars, Ivan established a paramilitary force loyal to him called the Oprichnina. Dressed in black and traveling quickly on horseback, the members showed fierce loyalty to Ivan. They were drawn from the lower-level bureaucrats and merchants to assure their loyalty to Ivan rather than to the boyars. The Oprichnina's methods would be later reflected in the development of the Russian secret police. The Romanov dynasty took control of Russia in 1613 after a period of turmoil following Ivan's death in 1584. Under the autocratic control of the Romanovs, three main groups in Russia had conflicting desires and agendas. The church, bent on conserving traditional values and beliefs, the boyars, desiring to gain and hold power, and members of the Tsar's royal family. The rise of the power of Peter I, known as Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, illustrates these conflicting ambitions. First, to gain full control of the throne, Peter had to defeat his half-sister Sophia and her supporters, a boyar-led elite military corps. He consolidated power by forcing Sophia into a convent. Later, the Stravetsky rebelled against Peter's reign, so he temporarily disbanded them and then integrated them into Russia's regular army. Peter the Great became co-Tsar of Russia at the age of 10. He survived several bloody coups due to the strength of his mother and her family. He went on to survive the regency of his evil half-sister and was now fully in control of Russia when he decided to travel. The 25-year-old Russian Tsar decided to go to Europe, but as reigning monarch, his journey would be swamped with pomp and ceremony. To avoid this formality, he decided to travel incognito so he could focus on the thing he wanted to do the most: learn. He said at the time, "I am a pupil and need to be taught." Upon arriving in Amsterdam, he partied hard like your typical 20-something backpacker, but also worked hard as an undercover shipbuilder. Despite binge drinking every night, Peter would arrive to the shipyard every day at dawn with his axe and tools slung over his shoulder like the other workmen. Then during lunch, he'd like to sit on a log by the dock and talk to sailors or pretty much anyone who addressed him as Carpenter Peter. It was a poorly kept secret that the 6'8" Russian, with an entourage of 250 Russian nobles, was indeed the Tsar. There was also a joke swirling around that the Russians were no more than baptized bears. On one occasion, 2 English noblemen came to the dock to catch a glimpse of the Tsar in order to point out which one was him. The foreman called out, "Carpenter Peter, why don't you help your comrades?" Without a word, Peter walked over, put his shoulder beneath a timber that several men were struggling to raise, and helped lift it into place. Peter's curiosity extended beyond the shipyard. He visited factories, laboratories, workshops, sawmills, paper mills, museums, and gardens. Everywhere he asked, "What is this for? How does it work?" Listening to the explanations, he'd nod. "Very good, very good." He also visited hospitals where he acquired some skill dissecting, drawing teeth, and performing minor operations. Those of his servants who fell ill tried to keep it a secret from the Tsar, lest he appear at their bedside with a case of instruments. He also dissected the dead, but one time while studying a corpse, he heard grumbles of disgust from some of his squeamish Russian nobles. Furious and to the horror of the Dutch, he ordered the Russians to approach, bend down, and bite off a muscle with their teeth. When Peter returned home from his 18-month European trip, he immediately began reforming his country according to what he had saw. Peter the Great was known as the defender of orthodoxy, participating closely in ecclesiastical affairs. However, Peter would eventually lose the support of the Russian clergy over his reforms. Later in his reign, Peter reorganized the Russian government by creating provinces, first 8 and later 50 administrative divisions. Provincial officials received a salary, replacing the old system of local officials feeding off the land or getting money through bribes, fees, and taxes. Another government reform was the creation of a Senate, a council to advise government officials when Peter was away. To ensure their control over large areas, the Ottoman sultans used a selection system called the Devshirim to staff their military and their government. This system began in the late 14th century and expanded in the 15th and 16th centuries. Through this system, Christian boys who were subjects of the empire were recruited to serve in the Ottoman government. Boys ages 8 to 20 were taken each year from conquered Christian lands in Europe. The system of Devshirim developed from an earlier system of slavery in the Ottoman Empire. In both systems, slaves were considered tribute owed to the empire after conquest, which was typically 1/5 of the conquered land's wealth. Since Islamic law prohibited enslavement of people of the book, or Muslims or Jews, Christian boys were forcibly removed from their families, especially from the Balkan territories. What develops over time is actually a system that benefited these young boys who probably at home would have lived a life of great poverty. Instead, the Christian boys were taught various skills in politics, the arts, and military, and received a very high level of education. The most famous group of them were called the Janissaries, and they formed the elite forces in the Ottoman army. Other boys were groomed to become administrators of the newly conquered territories. Some were scribes, tax collectors, and even diplomats. They were indoctrinated to be fiercely loyal to the Sultan. Some served as bodyguards. In some ways, becoming a Janissary provided a path of upward mobility in the Ottoman Empire. Even though Janissaries continued to be called slaves of the Sultan, some parents even wanted their sons to be recruited into service. Following the collapse of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, the Ming ruled in China from 1368 to 1644. The Ming dynasty in China wanted to erase the influence of Mongol rulers of the Yuan dynasty. To help accomplish this goal, the Ming brought back the traditional civil service exam, improved education by establishing a national school system, and reestablished the bureaucracy which had fallen into disuse under the Mongols. During the Qing dynasty and the later part of Qianlong's reign, the traditional efficient Chinese bureaucracy became corrupt, leveling high taxes on the people. The Qing government used harsh military control to put down a rebellion against these developments and to maintain its authority. Military leaders called shoguns ruled Japan in the emperor's name from the 12th to the 15th centuries. Yet conflict between land-holding aristocrats called the daimyo left Japan in disarray. Each daimyo had its own army of warriors known as the samurai, ambition to conquer more territory, and power to rule his fiefdom as he saw fit. So here's a map, or a pyramid that shows the different social structure. And of course, the emperor is up here, thought to be a god, but at this point he has very little power. He is really just a figurehead. That will change in the 1800s. The emperor takes his power back, but for now, it is the daimyo society that is ruling everything, and they're the ones that's actually giving the shogun power. The samurai are their individual warriors, and a strict culture will last, and it'll rise from this period and end with what we call the Meiji Restoration in 1860s. And then you have the peasants and the artisans, and of course, like the Chinese, the merchants were at the bottom of the social scale because it was thought they did not produce anything on their own. The samurai were paid, first in rice and later in gold, which gave them significant economic power. Finally, just as gunpowder weapons enabled the rise of new empires in Turkey, Persia, and India, gunpowder weapons helped a series of 3 powerful daimyo to gradually unify Japan. The first of these powerful daimyo was Ujana Nubanga. Armed with muskets purchased from Portuguese traders, Nubanga, with his samurai, took over Kyoto in 1568. He then began to extend his power, forcing daimyo in the lands around Kyoto to submit. Nobunga was unified about 1/3 of what is today Japan when he was assassinated in 1582. The next shogunate was Hideyoshi. He continued expanding the territory until most of what we now know as Japan was under his control. After his death in 1598, the center of power shifted to the city of Edo, or Tokyo, controlled by the daimyo Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was declared shogun in 1603. His successors would continue to rule Japan into the mid-19th century in an era known as the period of great peace. The Tokugawa shogunate set about reorganizing the governance of Japan in order to centralize control over what was essentially a feudal system. Japan was divided into 250 territories, each of which was controlled by a daimyo who had his own army and was fairly independent. However, the Tokugawa government required that the daimyo maintain residences both in their home territory and also in the capital. If the daimyo himself was visiting his home territory, his family had to stay in Tokyo, essentially as hostages. This kept the daimyo under the control of the shogunate, reducing them to landlords who managed the territory rather than independent leaders. Ruling from 1556 to 1605, Akbar proved to be the most capable of the Mughal rulers. For the first 40 years of his rule, he defeated Hindu armies and extended his empire southward and westward. From his capital in Delhi, Akbar established an efficient government and a system of fairly administered laws. For example, all his people had the right to appeal to him for final judgment in any lawsuit. As Akbar's fame spread, capable men from many parts of Central Asia came to serve him. They helped Akbar create a strong, centralized government and an effective civil service. Paid government officials called zamindars were in charge of specific duties such as taxation, construction, and the water supply. Later, zamindars were given grants of land rather than salaries, but were permitted to keep a portion of the taxes paid by local peasants, who contributed 1/3 of their produce to the government. The system worked well under Akbar. Under rulers who came after him, though, the zamindars began to keep more of the taxes they had collected. With this money, they built personal armies of soldiers and civilians loyal to them. By the end of the 16th century, centralization of power by controlling taxes, the army, and some aspects of religion had created a system of government that led to powerful kings and emperors and czars all over the world. Some methods used absolute monarchy, whereas others solidified authority by building temples or using religion or creating a military elite or a civil service that was loyal to them. Either way, these empires grew exponentially from 1415 to 1750, and they developed modern ways of maintaining huge empires.